Oh hi Weirdos! Dan Rossbach here, your lead discussant at the Weird Book Club. Today I'll be doing my take on the My Favorite Musicals tag, originally created by just one reader. The premise here being to choose as many of your favorite musicals as you feel like talking about, and matching them up with a book that you feel shares some sort of aesthetic or thematic similarity. Now I was tagged by Sean of Sean the Book Maniac fame, who, despite not really being a fan of musicals in general, found a way to make this tag his own. I won't ruin the surprise for you, but suffice it to say, if you've ever wanted to see someone do a literary riff on Soul Doctor, Journey of a Rockstar Rabbi, you should head over to his channel immediately. Now I too am a gay white male with absolutely no interest in musicals, and whereas a younger, more self-loathing version of me might have imagined that this set me apart in some special way from my queer brethren, I'm now mature enough to recognize that touting your deep-seated aversion to people suddenly joyously bursting into song probably just makes you seem dead inside. Which I am, don't get me wrong. If that hasn't been obvious so far from my reading tastes, it should come through loud and clear now that we're bringing music into the mix. My inherent incapacity for joy aside, Sean tagging me got me thinking about certain similarities between the ways I consume both books and music these days. Insofar as I purchase media, I tend to favor the older analog formats, something with a physical presence you can kinda snuggle up to. There's a ritualistic quality for me about the process of pulling a record out of its sleeve and placing it on the turntable, or flipping through the pages of my hardback to find where I left off. It seems to switch my brain into this more attentive, receptive state. Or so I tell myself to avoid feeling like a crotchety old technophobe. So, okay, simple enough. Instead of pairing books with musicals, I'll just use some of my favorite albums from the old vinyl crate. Aha! Not so fast. Because I also have a bunch of books from Women in Translation Month that I still want to talk about. A timely topic indeed, given that it ended a month ago. So, just to make things even more needlessly complicated, I'm going to 1. Rank those Women in Translation Month books from least to most favoritist. 2. Pair each one of those books with a record currently in my collection. 3. Contemplate the arbitrariness of this comparison and why I thought it was a good idea in the first place. And 4. Present a case for how these two drastically different works connect on a stylistic or thematic level. So let's start with the book I enjoyed least from my reading this August. Coming in at number 6, Revenge by Yoko Ogawa, translated by Stephen Snyder, and we're going to match this up with Another Thought by Arthur Russell. Okay, so let's kick things off by introducing our two players. Revenge is a series of interconnected short stories originally published in 1998 in Japanese, published for the first time in English translation in 2013. Roughly speaking, these stories are very loosely interconnected. They're billed on the cover as 11 Dark Tales, and that's true to varying degrees. Some have very explicit, murderous undertones, while others are more what you might call atmospherically creepy. Suffice it to say, no matter how seemingly normal a scenario may appear at the outset, you can count on some bizarre incident slowly slinking its way into the story. This we're comparing with Another Thought, which is a collection of a different sort. It was originally released in 1994, 2 years after Arthur Russell's death from HIV. These tracks were culled from an allegedly vast back catalog of unreleased music, Russell being quite a prolific producer of both sort of popular adjacent music and some quite experimental tracks. And I think that links us nicely to the first similarity I would draw between these two artists, which is their overall style, which has sort of a hushed, restrained quality, something that belies a very thoughtful, considered craftsperson who's not afraid to indulge their more experimental, shall we say, darker artistic impulses. Throughout Revenge, you're not going to find a lot of very showy sentences. The prose is quite meticulously crafted, and this thoughtful, considered nature even seems to carry over into the main characters' mindsets. Regardless of how bizarre the incidents are that they find themselves in, they approach them with this strange sense of calm that only seems to accentuate the overall eerie tone. It's easy to draw a parallel here between that understated delivery and the sort of hushed, intimate vocal delivery that permeate Arthur Russell's tracks in this collection. Russell was classically trained in the cello, which is featured on many of his songs throughout his discography in a way that you might not immediately recognize as a classical instrument. It's so distorted, played in such an eccentric manner, processed through many layers of digital effects.
And yet, over time, these seemingly understated components all start to add up into something that's emotionally explosive. This constant repetition of certain elements with certain details slightly tweaked gradually morphs them from something familiar, recognizable, even comfortable, into a new and exciting form that you could never have anticipated. To such an extent where it almost makes you go back and question how you were seeing and interpreting those elements when they were first introduced. And this interaction between repetition and memory is something that I will deeply associate with both of these works moving forward. Strangely enough, I had recalled starting Revenge years ago when it was first published in English, but I had absolutely no memory of actually finishing the book, an effect accentuated by the fact that all of the stories sort of bleed back and forth into one another as characters and creepy imagery cross over from one story to the next. And as I read, I kept waiting to get to the point where it became no longer familiar, only to reach the end and realize I actually had read this book in its entirety long ago and completely forgotten a majority of the experience. I think this is something that speaks both to the weakness of Revenge as a book and the strength of Another Thought as a collection of Arthur Russell's utterly unique musical creations. I would say that in art in general, I'm someone who loves crossover, callbacks, references to other works and artists that have a life of their own outside of the text that you're engaging with. When you're creating your own little self-contained world, where everything feels a few degrees off from the reality that we live in day to day, I think it becomes especially important that the individual pieces stand on their own enough, and that when they do reference one another, they're substantially adding to the overall sense of artistic enjoyment and complicating the meanings and symbols that were introduced earlier on. This is done fantastically well throughout Another Thought, where very distinctive lyrics and phrases recur from song to song, but with a vastly different tone. Take, for example, the title track, which is very discordant. The person speaking the lyrics seems confused, trying to regain their composure, almost in an atmosphere of desperation, trying to grasp onto some transcendent symbol of beauty. I'm on another thought now, my eyes touching the real face. While in another track, A Little Lost, this phrase returns in a deeply romantic context. I'm so busy thinking about kissing you, and now I wanna do that without entertaining another thought. And while my favorite moments on this compilation of Arthur Russell tracks come from these unexpected and delightful moments of artistic resonance between different songs, I would actually say that my favorite stories in Revenge are the ones that feel more insular, more standalone. A majority of the narrators are psychologically isolated in some way, which could account for their propensity towards outbursts of violence and general psychological disintegration. There's an almost Edgar Allan Poe, Fall of the House of Usher, Telltale Heart quality to the most distinctive stories that follow a single distinctive image to its bloody, writhing core. Stories like Old Mrs. J, which focuses on interactions between a somewhat withdrawn writer and her landlord, who at first seems like a stereotypically nosy, emotionally needy older person, constantly engrossed in the lives of her tenants, to perhaps an unhealthy extent, but then goes on to build personal bonds with them by sharing the abundance of vegetables that grow in her garden, which begin with increasing consistency to resemble human limbs, leading one to question what might be buried beneath that soil. There's also the Museum of Torture, in which a young woman who is spurned by her boyfriend stumbles into a strange collection of artifacts which have been used to inflict pain both physical and psychological on their victims throughout history. These range from the classic bone-breaking devices from medieval times to more subtle instruments of abuse and emotional harm that have been employed throughout modern interpersonal relationships. Though they don't necessarily carry a lot of deep symbolic and thematic heft, the undeniable emotional punch they deliver was enough to elicit my respect, even though overall I found the collection to be relatively hit or miss. But the bright side of all of this, and maybe the final parallel I'm going to draw between these two works, is that both Revenge and Another Thought are indicative of a large, rich back catalog that's still out there for all of us to explore. Yoko Ogawa has been published consistently in Japan since 1989, and despite winning multiple literary awards in Japan, and the sheer talent and tenacity required to sustain a literary career of over 3 decades, Very few of her works have been published into English, the most recent of which to be published this year was Memory Police, a book that was originally published in Japan all the way back in 1994, and despite being 15 years old, is garnering significant critical acclaim in the English-speaking literary community. The same can be said of Arthur Russell, who, despite being a consistent creative force, had very few official studio albums released in his lifetime. Some of his best-known works today, including Another Thought, are archival albums, and they seem to keep coming out at fairly regular intervals. And while I wouldn't suggest that every unreleased track he ever produced is absolute artistic gold, the fact that thoughtful curators are able to continually mine his back catalog for material that still sounds fresh, experimental, and transgressive today seems to suggest that we may be able to engage with exciting and fresh material from Arthur Russell for years to come.
That I can't get you. Keep it up, yeah. With the feeling, oh, yeah, getting to know what you like and what you love.